Let's start the second half of the HTML crash course by looking at tables, one of the most widely used HTML elements. And so you have a table tag, optionally with a border. As we'll see shortly, you typically draw borders when you're presenting actual tabular data to the user, and you leave the borders off when you're using tables just to align things and arrange them in the page. Optionally, you can have a caption element inside the table element. That's the heading above the table. But the most important thing is that the table element contains TRs. Table rows. And so inside the TRs, you can have TH for table headings or TD for table data cells. And unless you use col span, column span, a cell that spans multiple columns, or row span, a cell that spans multiple rows, each of the TRs typically has the same number of elements. So a common format is to have the first TR contain the headings. So suppose you have 5 THs in the first TR, then the next TR would have 5 TDs, and the next one would have 5 TDs, and the next one would have 5 TDs. So here's a quick example. In this case, I'm presenting tabular data, so I have borders turned on. I use the caption element, and then I have a bunch of TRs. There's no rule that says the THs have to go at the top, but in this case, I have it that way. So I start off with THs, table headings, and then the other rows have TDs, table data cells. And a possible rendering is shown at the bottom. Now, some notes on this example. Tables with borders are typically used when you're actually presenting a table of information, tabular data, to the end user. But tables without borders are also widely used. One thing that they're used for is to control the alignment and the layout of elements in the page. For example, it's very common when you have an HTML form where you're collecting input from the user, we'll get to that later, and you have, say, a prompt, enter your first name, and then a text field where the user enters their first name. You want to make sure that the prompt and the text field always stay on the same line, so that if the browser is resized, the text field doesn't wrap around to the line underneath the prompt, because that would be confusing to the end user. A common solution to this is to put the prompt and the text field in a row of a table, but turn the borders of the table off, so that the end user doesn't really know that it is a table. It just observes that the prompt and the text field are next to each other. You can also use invisible tables for sidebars and for columns of text on the right or the left and so forth. Now, the real CSS experts make the very valid point that if you use divs for alignment and control where they appear on the page by floating them to the left or the right with CSS, that you have a lot more flexibility in kind of relaying out the page later without rewriting the HTML. Now, this is certainly true. However, there are a number of tasks that are difficult to do with divs, like making sure the prompt and the text field stay next to each other, that are quite easy to do with invisible tables. So you should certainly consider, if you have a sidebar, using a div and having CSS do the alignment, but using tables, at least for simple alignment, is not a bad thing and is very frequently done in real life. Okay, on the previous slide, my sample rendering had the table headings in blue and with a relatively big font. This is not automatic. Table headings by default come out centered and bold, but the color and the fact that it was a slightly larger size was because I had a style sheet attached to the page that said TH's table headings should be rendered that way. It's not automatic. And captions, although there is a caption element for table, and although kind of semantically it's very meaningful, oh, this is the label of the table, and so that a screen reader or a page analysis tool would know that's the caption of the table. So it kind of makes sense. Nevertheless, it's quite common in real life that developers omit the caption tag and just put regular HTML above or below the table that gives the description of the table. All right, so let's look in a little more detail at the table element itself. One of the most useful attributes for invisible tables is align. If you say align equals right, that's very similar to what images do. The table kind of floats to the right and text wraps around it. So that's very useful for sidebars. border, of course, we saw. And this is a case where the general advice of HTML5, use CSS for formatting, not HTML for formatting, kind of breaks down. It's very difficult to make CSS put in borders in a table. Or let me say it more forcefully. It's very difficult to make CSS put in borders in a table that looks visually appealing. It's kind of three-dimensional and looks etched like the default rendering of tables with borders, and is consistent across browsers. But it's easy to say border equals 1 or border equals 2 to make a visually appealing table border that looks consistent across browsers. So borders of tables is a case where even the CSS experts tend to use an HTML attribute for controlling the look of the table rather than purely CSS. You can give background colors to tables either in CSS or using the bgcolor attribute. This can be used for tables themselves, or it can be used for sidebars. I also want to point out that you can give background colors to table rows. The TR element also has a bgcolor attribute, and that's very widely used for kind of doing zebra striping, where every other row or every 3 rows are a different color. And so then if you turn the borders off, the end user can kind of run their finger horizontally across the page and keep track of which row is which and not lose their place. You can also put background images for tables, and that's illegal for TD and TH as well, but not for TR, only for individual cells. All right, more attributes, width and height. This is quite useful, especially when you want to have kind of a fixed size that floats someplace. You can also give the width and the height in percentages rather than in pixels. You can control the amount of space between adjacent cells. You can control the amount of padding between the text inside the cell and the border of the cell. You can control the lines that are drawn between the cells, and you can control the lines that are drawn around the outside of the table. All right, a bit more detail on the TR element. As we saw, it's used to define each row of the table, and then inside of each TR is a mixture of TH and TD elements. TR also has an align attribute, but this is different than the align attribute of the table. The align attribute of the table, if it's left or right, causes the table to float to either the left or the right side of the page and text wrap around it. Whereas the align attribute of TR is the default alignment of the text inside each of the data cells. You can also do the vertical alignment so that if there's extra space, you determine whether there's extra space on the top or the bottom or everything floats to the middle. And you can give a background color of the row. So it's possible to give a background color to the table as a whole and then override it for some of the rows. It's much more common, however, to omit the background color of the entire table, but to give background colors for different rows, in particular every other row, just to make it easier for the end user, if there's no borders, to keep track of which row is which, especially when the text is small. A little more detail on TH and TD. TH and TD can only be used inside TR, but there's no restriction that the THs are in the first row. They can be mixed anywhere that you want. Really, the only difference is the default visual appearance. By default, in other words, if you don't override it with your own CSS file, TH uses bold text and centers the information. TD uses whatever text you were using already, and it left aligns the information. You can change this with CS, but other than that, TH and TD are drawn the same way and are used the same way. So the real difference is not in the visual appearance, because you can override that with CSS. The real difference is in the kind of underlying semantic meaning. Oh, THs are the headings. They describe what's in the table. TD is the content that's being presented. But the most common scenario is the first row contains the THs and the later rows contain the TDs. Now, if you want kind of real headers, you can enclose some of the rows inside an element called thead. And when I mean real headers, what I mean is if you print it and the table is long and it breaks across multiple pages, these header will be repeated on each of the printouts. And same thing if you want footers, you can use tfoot. So th, when you print a web page that contains a table, the th, if it's in the first row, will not be repeated if the table happens to break across multiple pages when printed, but it will be if you enclose one or more rows inside thead. All right, th and td have some attributes. There was an align attribute of table that shows how the table floats in the page. There was an align attribute of tr, that's the default alignment of the table data cells, but then you can override it with the align attribute of the individual data cells. You can also use align equals char to line things up on a particular character. So for example, if you have some numbers and you want to line it up on the decimal point, you can do that using char. Vertical alignment, width and height. Now be careful with width and height because sometimes you don't know the amount of text that will appear in the data cells. So it's more common to let the browser calculate the width and the height of the table data cells automatically. You can give background colors to the individual cells. It's more common to give background colors to the row as a whole, but it's certainly allowed to have individual cells be different colors. And finally, you can use no wrap to turn off word wrapping, but use this carefully because if you don't know the size of the page and the size of the table, it might be hard to have the table look good if you turn off word wrapping and each line break in the source code becomes a line break in the resultant table. All right, one very useful addition is the ability to have cells that span rows or columns. Row span is a tall cell that goes up higher or down lower and spans multiple rows. Col span defines a wide cell that straddles more than one column. So here's the idea. Oh, I say th, but I say col span equals 2. So this first heading will span 2 columns. So I got this big heading over here. I said normally each tr has the same number of elements. And the first tr had 2 elements, but one of them said col span equals 2. So you have to remember when you get to the second row, oh, there's really 3 columns because one of the headings in the first column spanned multiple columns, so then I have to have 3. But I can also have row span. That means this cell will drop down and take up some space in the subsequent row. So when I get to the subsequent row, I have to remember, oh, I had a cell from above drop down in, and so even though there's supposed to be 3 cells per row, I only define 2 here. Another way of doing complicated formatting like this is to have nested tables. So inside of a TD or a TH, not inside a TR, inside a TD or TH, you can have another table. And if that table's borders are turned off, then you can do the further nested information.